So you're there in John chapter 19. And as you know, we're getting close to Easter. And yes, I said Easter. It's not a pagan holiday. And I will cover that on Easter. But we're not talking about that today. What I wanted to talk about today, and we read a chapter about Jesus' crucifixion. And so I wanted to talk about the timeline of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Because there's one of the big reasons is, I get this day off too. It's like it's a national, I guess, day to get off. I don't know how PTO day, but Good Friday. Good Friday. Now, Good Friday is a hoax. Now, why I say it's a hoax is because Good Friday, what they say with Good Friday is that Jesus died on Friday. And when did Jesus raise from the dead? Now, everybody knows that. No, I don't think anybody disputes that that he rose from the dead on Sunday morning, right? Now, but so if you think about Good Friday, well, how long was he supposed to be in the grave? How many days? 3 days, 3 nights, right? And so if he died on Friday, and let's say you gave him Friday as being a day, and you said, okay, that's the day, Friday. Well, Saturday's a day. And let's say you were to even give him Sunday and say, okay, well, that's a part of Sunday. That's day. Well, how many nights, though? Friday night, Saturday night. You only have 2 nights. And so I'm going to show you why they had that misconception or why people think that, and where that probably came from, because it's just a misunderstanding. But I believe, and people have different thoughts on this. Some people believe that he died on a Wednesday evening, but I personally believe he died on a Thursday evening, and I'm going to give you my reason why. But I'm not against people that believe on Wednesday. I am against people that believe it's on Friday. Okay, so Friday just doesn't make sense because you wouldn't get 3 days and 3 nights out of that. But you're in John chapter 19. But I'm going to, stick your finger in there. And actually, I made a chart. You're like, man, you're an engineer. Because I always have to put things in charts. Visuals are always great. So Brother Joseph and Brother Eric, if you don't mind, I don't know if I'll have enough for every single person. So make sure at least each family has one. And then if you want one, like if you say, well, we want some more, I'll make some more copies. So I made a little chart as far as the timeline of when Jesus died and when he rose again. And I put some scripture references on there. And, right now it may not make too much sense because you're saying, what in the world is Abib? And like all this other stuff, and 14th day and all this. But I'm going to cover that. And so this is kind of just a little chart I put together to kind of visualize it. But we're going to get into that. So, yeah, and if you have extras, I'll just put them up here. So where does this Good Friday hoax come from? Where do they come in and say, okay, well, he died on Friday? Well, keep a finger in John 19 and go to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15 and verse 42. Because what it comes from is that the next day, when Jesus died, the next day was a Sabbath. So I want you to see that. When you're reading it in Mark, you may say, well, okay, this is the 7th day of the week. This would be Saturday. So that's where they get this, is that the next day was a Sabbath. That's why they took him off the cross before the Sabbath day. And so in Mark 15 and verse 42, it says, and now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath. So the day that he died, it was called the preparation, and it was the day before the Sabbath. Now, when you see Sabbath, you're automatically thinking the 7th day of the week, that day of rest, that they were supposed to rest on that Sabbath day. But what you have to understand is that there's other Sabbaths in the Bible besides that 7th day. And so when you read through the Bible, and I'll show you that, but there's other days that are Sabbath. Sabbath just means the day of rest. It's just a resting day. Now, there's a lot of days actually throughout the year that they would do certain feasts where they would rest on a certain day, and they weren't supposed to do any work in it. But it wasn't necessarily the 7th day of the week, because it just depended. Because it would be like the first day of the 7th month was supposed to be a Sabbath of rest. I'll show you that. But as you know, in a calendar year, that day's not always going to fall on a Saturday. So there's certain days that are going to be a Sabbath, but it's not necessarily the 7th day Sabbath. And so, so when you're reading through like Mark and Matthew and stuff like that, and you see that, and you're like, okay, it looks like it's Friday then. Now I say Friday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm just using that because that's what we see. But obviously they're just going to say the first day of the week or like the day of the month, okay? Because they didn't use those like Thursdays, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. What's interesting is I'm learning modern Greek, mainly to stop the gainsayers. But also, it'd be cool to give the gospel to a Greek-speaking person. But anyway, all that to say is that in Greek, if you look at the Friday, they use just numbers. So like, actually Sunday is called the Lord's Day, and then Monday is the second day, third day, fourth day. But then when you get to Friday, Friday's called the preparation, and Saturday is called the Sabbath. So it's interesting because even in modern Greek, I'm talking modern Greek, people that are just in Greece right now call Saturday the Sabbath, and they call Friday the preparation. So obviously, why would it be the preparation? Because they had to prepare the fact that they weren't going to be working for that whole day. Okay? But there's another preparation, and it's not talking about the seventh day. So in John 19, go back to John 19, look at verse 14. Because it kept saying it's the preparation, it's the preparation. So even in Mark it says it was the preparation of what? Well, it's a preparation of a Sabbath, but a certain Sabbath. Okay? So in John 19 verse 14 it says, and it was the preparation of the what? Passover. And about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, behold your king. So in John 19 it says that this is the preparation of the Passover. Okay? And then in verse 31, notice what it says. It says, in verse 31, it says, the Jews therefore, because it was the preparation, so that day that Jesus is being killed is called the preparation, and it called specifically the preparation of the Passover, that the body should not remain upon the cross on the Sabbath day. Notice in parentheses there, it says, for that Sabbath day was an high day. So you notice it's putting a distinction on that Sabbath day? That it's a high day. Now, we would look at it as far as a holiday. Now, what we see in Colossians talks about Sabbath days and the feasts, talking about those days and stuff like that, and how in the New Testament we don't keep the Sabbath and we don't keep these feasts of the Old Testament and stuff like that. And Colossians 2 is a great passage. If anybody's ever, I ran into people that were, I don't know if they were Seventh-day Adventist or Hebrew roots guys, but they were all about, you got to keep the Sabbath, you got to keep the Sabbath. Well, I took them to Colossians 2 and stopped them in their tracks on that, because in Colossians 2 in verse 16 it says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holiday or holy day, or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, plural, notice that it's plural, Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. So the Sabbath days, not just the end of the week Sabbath, but also the Sabbath days dealing with the feasts of the Lord, and those were done away in Christ, meaning that they were a shadow of things to come, but Christ fulfilled those on the cross. So when you think of the fourth commandment, which is to remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, that was fulfilled in Christ. Now, the Sabbath day was not a moral law, and what people get confused on is they say, well, that means all the law is fulfilled. No, he didn't fulfill thou shalt not murder. Okay, that's still in place today. You don't fulfill moral law, you fulfill customary law, and you fulfill these cardinal ordinances and stuff that were imposed on them until the time of Reformation. Okay, but go to Leviticus chapter 23, and you'll be like, good night, we're going to Leviticus? Yes. Now, actually, you'll learn a lot from Leviticus 23, because Leviticus 23 covers the feasts of the Lord. And there's actually a lot of information, because we're going to be talking about the Passover. Because the Passover, Jesus was crucified on the Passover. And do you think that's a coincidence? Do you think that's a coincidence that Jesus, Christ our Passover, was crucified on the Passover, the exact day of the Passover? And so I want to show you this, because when you look at that chart and you'll see the 14th day, the 15th day, and stuff like that, this is why I'm putting that on there. But in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 4, so right before that it was talking about the seventh day was a Sabbath, right? But there's also other Sabbaths dealing with these feasts. And notice in verse 4, it says, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread. In the first day ye shall have an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein. But ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is an holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein." So what's this saying? It's saying that you have the Passover. So the 14th day is what they're calling, that the Bible's calling the Passover. But on the 15th day, that next day was a Sabbath. And then you would keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. And on the 7th day would also be a Sabbath. So it didn't matter where this could fall on a Saturday, you know. Just because of the way the calendar would work, every once in a while you'd probably have a case where that first day was actually on a Saturday and that 7th day was on a Saturday, right? And so that could happen, but this a lot of times is going to be in the case where that's actually happening in the midst of a week somewhere. And so that happened. That's showing you that it's not just the end of the day, end of the week that's actually a Sabbath day. And now the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what you'll see in the New Testament is that the 14th day is lumped in with the 15th through the 21st, okay? And where as far as it being called the Passover, being called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Luke 22:1 says, "Now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover." Okay? So the Passover, sometimes they'll just say the Feast of Passover, sometimes they'll say the Feast of Unleavened Bread, sometimes they'll just say the Passover. And so a lot of times, sometimes when it's talking about the Passover, it's just talking about the 14th day, but sometimes it's talking about that whole feast. Okay? And so in Ezekiel, just another verse to kind of show that the Passover is called that 7-day feast as well. It says in the first month, in Ezekiel 45 verse 21, if you want to note these. I know we're kind of going through a lot of different stuff here, so if you can't turn to it, that's okay, but you may just want to write down the references. In Ezekiel 45 verse 21, it says, "In the first month, in the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten." So you see how that's used a lot. And the reason that I'm really pointing this out is because I'm going to show you a passage that is a so-called contradiction in the Bible. And I say so-called because it's not, obviously. But I'm going to show you how to answer that and how this makes sense and how it would make sense as far as the timeline would go. But you're in Leviticus 23, if you're still there. Leviticus 23. I just want to show you because you say, well, it doesn't say Sabbath. It doesn't say it's called a Sabbath on the first day of unleavened bread and on the 7th day of unleavened bread. It just says it's a holy convocation where you do no servile work. Well, what is the Sabbath? Obviously, that's what it says. But in verse 24 of that same chapter, here's where it actually, this is dealing with the blowing of trumpets. So there's a feast in the fall feasts. The first feast is the Feast of Trumpets. In verse 24, it says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets and holy convocation. Ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord." So there it's plainly saying that first day of the first day of the 7th month is a Sabbath, and that can fall wherever it does on any day of the week, you know, throughout the years. And so a Sabbath, that's why it says, you know, Sabbaths plural in Colossians, because it's not just talking about, take that Hebrew roots, guys, right? It's not just talking about the fact that it's the 7th day of the week is done away, but also all these feasts, we don't observe them. Now, some of these feasts, what they represented still haven't happened yet. And so I'll probably do a sermon on that, dealing with end times and dealing with the fall feasts. But what we'll find is that actually the spring feast, what we call the spring feasts, like the Passover, Days of Unleavened Bread, the first fruits, and the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, were all fulfilled already. But what we're waiting for is a fall feast, because what's the harvest represent? The end of the world. And so the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles is something that is in the future, but it doesn't mean that we have to keep those feasts, okay, just because they haven't been done yet. Those were only imposed on them until the time of Reformation, but they do still represent that. So But we see that Jesus, when he was crucified, the next day was a Sabbath, because what was the next day? The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first day, meaning the 15th day of the month, and so that day was a high day. That Sabbath was a high day because it wasn't the regular Sabbath. It was a significant Sabbath. It was a holiday Sabbath, right? And so we see that through the feast of the Lord. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is where Christ is called our Passover. And I won't be here next weekend, but I'll be here for Easter. And I'm going to be preaching a sermon on Easter and the resurrection and all that stuff. But I'm going to show you that Easter is a biblical term and that it's not a pagan holiday. And I have the Tyndale Bible to prove it to you. But in this passage, it actually calls Jesus the Easter Lamb. So we'll get to that when we get to Easter. I'll show you that. But here it calls Christ our Passover. Why would it call him our Passover? Because he's the literal Passover. What that Passover was representing from the very beginning, Christ did it, and he did it on the exact day that they were actually killing the Passover. He was being killed on the cross when the lamb was to be slain for that Passover feast. But in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, it says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." So we're keeping the feast, but not like they did in the Old Testament. So, and obviously we had the Lord's Supper. We're going to be doing that tonight. And but that's obviously what, in the New Testament, that's how we're remembering Christ's death. We're remembering his sacrifice as our Passover. And so we don't sacrifice a literal lamb and drain the blood and eat the lamb and all that stuff. So, but go to Exodus chapter 12, because I want to show you the actual Passover. And we'll see how this lines up with when Jesus died. So Exodus 12 is where the first Passover, the Passover that they actually did when the firstborn of the children of Egypt were killed. So Exodus chapter 12. And this is the reason. Now, this doesn't really prove why it's not on Wednesday, but why on Thursday. The reason I believe it's on a Thursday is because if Jesus died on Wednesday evening, let's say he died on Wednesday evening, and he was in the grave Wednesday night, Thursday night, Wednesday night, then you have Thursday night, then you'd have Friday night, then you'd have Saturday. He would literally have to be, because it'd be 3 nights and 3 days up to that point, he'd have to raise from the dead before Saturday night. Because then after that, it'd be past 72 hours. Now you could say, okay, well, he was actually in there for a little past 72 hours, and 72 hours would be 3 days, right? But I think you're getting a little further past that as far as okay, he's been in there longer than 3 days and 3 nights at that point. And so that's my take on that. So that's why what I'm preaching here about the 14th day and the 15th day and all that stuff, this doesn't really affect that. As far as if you want to say it's on Wednesday and I say it's on Thursday, it doesn't really affect that. But what I want to really prove is that the day Jesus died was the 14th. Now, some believe that was actually the 13th and the next day was the 14th and then the 15th. And so they believe that the 14th was a Sabbath, the 15th was a Sabbath, and then the Saturday was a Sabbath, and then he rose from the dead. Okay? But I don't see anywhere where it says the 14th day is a Sabbath day. And actually what we'll find here is that the lamb was actually killed at the end of the 14th day at even, and then the next day, literally the next day is when they went out of Egypt, which was the 15th day. And so that's what I want to show you. That's why, and this is why it's important, because of the so-called contradiction in the Bible. Because I believe Jesus died at the end of the 14th day, and I'll show you why that's important to understand, the so-called contradiction, okay? So in Exodus chapter 12, verse 3, it says, Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, in the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for an house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats, and ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. Evening of what? The 14th day. And verse 29, notice what it says. So they killed this thing at the evening of the 14th day. And remember, they were eating the Passover throughout the night, and their feet shod and all this stuff. Well, on verse 29 there, it says, and it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne, unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, and he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as ye have said. So notice what's going on here. You have the 14th day, and the lamb is being slain in the evening, and they're eating the Passover, and at midnight, this is when this happens. At midnight is when all the firstborn are being killed, and then in the middle of the night there is where Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron and says, you need to get out of here. And if you say, well, okay, but maybe they stayed for another day and then they left. We'll go to Numbers chapter 33. Numbers 33, we'll kind of put that to bed. Numbers 33 and verse 3 gives us a little more information about when they left. So, Numbers 33 and verse 3. Numbers 33 and verse 3. It says, and they departed from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. On the morrow after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with an high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians. And notice verse 4, we're talking about the actual, what the event. It says, for the Egyptians buried all their firstborn, which the Lord had smitten among them upon their gods. Also the Lord executed judgments. So we see here that when did they depart? On the 15th day. And so we see here that what was going on. Notice the 10th day too. And this is what's interesting about this. What I believe is that the 10th day they would find this lamb. And they would keep this lamb from the 10th day to the 14th day and make sure that it didn't have any blemish or any ill favor to it at all. Because what did the lamb represent? Jesus Christ. A lamb slain without spot and without blemish. And so this lamb needed to be, as perfect as can be because it represented Jesus. And so they would keep this lamb from the 10th day to the 14th day. Now, do you remember what happened right before Jesus died on the cross? He went into Jerusalem on the ass's colt, and they took palms in their hands, and they started praising the Lord, saying, Hosanna in the highest, and it talks about praising the Son of David, and Hosanna in the highest. So they're praising the Lord, and obviously that was a fulfillment of Scripture. But if you go back, when you look at that in the story, I believe that actually was the 10th day, when that happened. And so basically you can imagine it's like the lamb being presented before the people, and obviously they killed him, right? So, but you get this, and I know in Catholic churches they have what you would call Palm Sunday. So if you were to say Palm Sunday, let's say you were to backtrack or go forward from Sunday, if you were to go back from Thursday, which would be the 14th, what would be Wednesday, the 13th, what would be Tuesday, the 12th, what would be Monday, the 11th, and what would be Sunday, the 10th. So Sunday, the Sunday before he rose from the dead, I believe he was being presented to Israel as a lamb without blemish. On the 14th day, they killed him, and then he rose again the third day. And so you see how this all fits, and how that wasn't by accident? Like the Bible's perfect, and all this stuff fits like a glove. And so that's why you see the 14th day of Abib. And Abib, what was going on here is that God made that month where this Passover was happening the first day or first month of the year. And so to them, it was the first month of the year, and which kind of makes sense if you think about spring. You know, you would think about that as being the beginning of the year and stuff. We started in January, but, you know, it's not always that way with some cultures. And so, so anyway, Abib is just that first month of the year for them. And so you'll see other Ziph and all this other stuff when you're dealing with the different months, numbers of years. But it's the first month, okay? It's the first month of the year to them. And so the 14th day was the day they were killing the Passover. And the 15th day was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, meaning it was the first day that they'd had that Sabbath, and they'd have to eat unleavened bread the whole time for that 7-day period. So, so what I believe is that you have basically Jesus died on the 14th day at the end of that 14th day. The next day was a Sabbath, which would be Friday. And then the next day was actually the Sabbath of the week. And then he rose again the third day. And so, but the reason why I say that, he died on the 14th day and not the 13th day, and first of all, I don't see where the 14th day is a Sabbath. I can't find that. I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I just don't see where the 14th day is called a Sabbath. I see where the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the 15th day, but the New Testament, the reason it's a little confusing is because the New Testament actually lumps in the 14th day in that week. Okay, and it calls that 14th day, the whole 14th day would be lumped in with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So, and obviously part of that 14th day was a part of that feast because they'd had to kill the Passover. It was the preparation, right? That preparation day. And so what you'll find is that day is linked in there with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's one feast, okay? But that 14th day was really what kind of would start that feast because you had to kill the Passover. But go to Matthew 26, and this is why you say, well, why are you going through all this stuff about the 14th day, 15th day? Well, I do want to show you, first of all, that the day after he was crucified was a Sabbath day, and it wasn't the Saturday. So that gets rid of the whole Good Friday, hoax thing. And so the misunderstanding just comes with the fact that they don't realize that there's other types of Sabbaths besides the last day of the week. But what you'll find is that Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples the night before he was killed. So how do you reconcile that? Was the Passover supposed to be killed when Jesus ate the Lord's Supper or when he died on the cross? And so what you'll find is that's where people come in and say, well, which was it, When was the Passover? Was it when Jesus ate the Last Supper or when it was when he died on the cross? Well, this is where that comes from, because notice in Matthew 26 and verse 17, it says, "Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The Master saith, My time is at hand, I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover." Now, I don't believe this was the 15th day when he said this. I believe this was actually the 14th day. And what you have to understand when you're reading through the Feast of the Lord, that day started at even. Now, even is a little different than evening, okay? Because what even means is basically sunset or sunrise, okay? Basically when the sun is even with the horizon. That's where that kind of comes from. So there's actually two evens in each day. You'd have the even of the sun rising and then the even of the sun setting. And so basically at even is when that new day would start. Now that's not out of the ordinary, because when does our new day start? Midnight. So think about it. It's kind of strange that we'd start at midnight because it's midnight, but that's when the next day would start, right? And so, but we'll see, when you look through Exodus, they weren't to eat unleavened bread from even on. So that started them not eating unleavened bread. And so what I believe is that when did he eat this Last Supper with his disciples? It was at night. And so when it says the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I believe they're talking about the 14th day, but it was the start of the 14th day. Does that make sense? They were just starting the 14th day, so it literally was the Passover day. and he was keeping the Passover with his disciples before he went to the cross to be killed as the lamb. So it was on the 14th day. Now, if this was the 13th day, I don't see how you'd say this is the first day of unleavened bread. Does that make sense? Because the 14th day, I can see how you could lump that in because that's a part of the feast. You can see how they would lump that in with the days of unleavened bread because they weren't supposed to have any leaven in the house in this day. So you can see how they would consider that the first day, and that would be the first day of unleavened bread, even though that's not the 15th where there's a Sabbath day, right? And we know this wasn't a Sabbath either when they were there, trying to kill Jesus. So that's why it's important to me is that according to this, it makes sense that the 14th day was actually starting when Jesus was eating the Last Supper with his disciples. They was in it, and so the whole rest of the time, you remember he was betrayed by Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane during the night, and then Peter denied him 3 times at the cock crowing. So when it was dawn, he denied him. And so what's interesting though, and just to prove that, they hadn't eaten the Passover, like the Jews themselves haven't killed the Passover, eaten it yet, because notice in John chapter 18. So John chapter 18, this is after Peter has already denied Christ 3 times, and they're taking Jesus from Caiaphas to the hall of judgment. So they're taking him to Pilate. And notice what the Jews say dealing with the Passover. John chapter 18, verse 28, it says, "Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover." So they're basically, they want to be clean. They don't want to not be able to eat the Passover. And then in chapter 19, we see, and obviously this is the narrator speaking, okay? So the narrator's right when it says this. The narrator says in verse 14, "And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he saith unto the Jews, Behold your king." So it calls it the preparation of the Passover. The Jews saying, hey, we don't want to go in there because we don't want to be defiled, right? We want to be able to eat the Passover. But Jesus said, I've longed, basically he's been wanting to eat this Passover with his disciples, and obviously that's a transition as far as the Old Testament, New Testament. Once he dies, that's where that transition happens. But he's talking about his death, so that how they would keep the Passover is changing a little bit because we're not going to be keeping it that way. And so he technically did eat the Passover at even on the 14th day, if you think about it, because it's right at the start of the 14th day at even. But they would kill the Passover at the end of at the evening on the 14th day. So I believe that's how you reconcile that. It's not a contradiction, because it literally was the Passover when he was eating the Passover with them, but they didn't literally kill the lamb until later. They didn't kill him until the end of the 14th day. And that's how you reconcile that. If it was the 13th day, I don't see how you would say that was the first day of unleavened bread. And again, it never says 14th or 13th day in the New Testament. It never gives you that information. So I'm just giving you that information as far as understanding how the Passover was kept in the Old Testament. So, but that's how I reconcile that. So we see that Jesus ate the Passover. And he died at the evening, in the evening, okay? So in Matthew 27, go to Matthew 27, and a lot of this stuff you already know, but he died in the evening, and the reason, there's a big deal about getting him off the cross before the Sabbath day. And so I believe he died before sunset. Okay, because that was the whole point, is that they didn't want to go into the Sabbath day with them on the cross. That's why they broke the legs of the 2 that were beside him, and they pierced him with a spear instead of breaking his legs, because obviously, the scripture had to be fulfilled that they wouldn't break any of his bones. But it's a big deal that they got him off the cross before it was night. Okay, so I believe it was in the evening, but we would say evening before it's actually dark, right? And you say it's the evening, but it's the sun's starting to set and all that stuff, so it's not even yet. So they killed him in the evening, and that's what it says in Exodus 12. Remember, it says you killed the Passover in the evening. And so it's exactly what they did in Exodus with the lamb, they did with Jesus. And so in Matthew 27, verse 45, notice what it says. It says, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, it doesn't say the exact hour that he died, but it sounds like it's pretty close to this, because right after this it talks about him giving up the ghost. And so at this point, that's where you get into it is finished, and he gave up the ghost, or said, I thirst, and then he gave up the ghost. And so there's, I believe it was around the 9th hour. Now, you say, well, how do you know that that's not like at dark? Well, if you know there's 12 hours in a day, that's what, throughout the Bible, and I'm not going to show you those references, there's 12 hours in a day, so the way they would, at least in this chapter in Matthew, they were going from basically sunrise to sunset as far as the time period. And there's about 12 hours in there depending on the time of year, right? And so you'd have 12 hours to the 9th hour is basically 3 hours until even, right? And so obviously it could be a little after that, but I believe it's giving us that time period for a reason. So basically, I believe in the 9th hour, somewhere around there, is where he died. And so he was on the cross for a little while there. 3 hours, it was just completely dark. And then at the 9th hour is when he's saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then he gives up the ghost. And so, what I believe is that it's on Thursday. So when you look at that chart, you'll see in parentheses, there's Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so what you'll see is that if Jesus died on the 14th day, and if it was a Thursday, you have a little portion of Thursday in there. You have a whole night. Then you have another day on Friday. Then you have a whole night. And then you have Saturday, which is a whole day, and then a night. So you definitely have 3 nights there. And what I want to show you is that Jesus rose early the first day of the week. And so going into what we would call Sunday a little bit is where we get into where Jesus rose from the dead. And so go to Mark chapter 16. Mark chapter 16. And you may say, well, I never really even thought about it that deep. That's fine, And obviously we take it by faith that it's 3 days, 3 nights. But even the disciples, if you look at the end of Matthew, they were sending a watch there saying, he said on the 3rd day he was going to rise again. And so they knew it was 3 days later. They knew they were setting a watch for the 3rd day. So there's no disputation. I don't ever see a disputation like, oh, it wasn't really in there for 3 days and they're trying to dispute that or something like that. But I believe that the wording and how stuff's structured in here is where people get confused on that. And so I'm just showing you that it really was 3 days and 3 nights. I don't believe it necessarily had to be 72 hours, exactly to the T. Okay, it doesn't ever says that. So when you say like 3 days from now, it doesn't mean that you have to be 3 days to the minute marker, that's happening. It just means it's approximately 3 days later. It's 3 days later. And even if you were to say this, if you said 3 days ago, what day would you be thinking of? Thursday, right? Because you'd be saying, well, Saturday, Friday, Thursday, 3 days ago. And so just in a common way of just thinking about it, 3 days from Thursday, you'd say Friday, Saturday, Sunday would be the 3rd day. Does that make sense? And so, but I don't believe he was in there longer than 3 days. So if people want to believe that Jesus rose from the dead like in the evening of Saturday, that's fine. But it's just, to me, what it says here in Mark, notice in Mark chapter 16 verse 1. And it says, and when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. And very, very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And actually other places, and I don't have it written down, the other Gospels say, before it was light. So we're talking early, the sun is rising. So Jesus did rise from the dead, before the sun rising. But we would still say like 5 o'clock is the morning, even though it's still dark out, right? And so you can see how it's still very early in the morning. We'd say it's very early in the morning, even though the sun hasn't risen yet. And so in Mark 16, verse 9, though, notice what it says. Now, when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week. So when was he risen? The first day of the week. Now, it was very early. It was before the rising of the sun. So he rose, I believe he rose from the dead before they got there, but right before they got there. And so he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. If you remember, when she went to the sepulcher, he thought that Jesus was the gardener, or and so until he revealed himself to her. And so, but in Luke 24, notice what it says. Luke 24. Luke 24 and verse 21. I'm just showing you why I believe it's Thursday. If people believe it's Wednesday, I'm fine with that. I'm not against them. But even with the 14th, 15 day, subject, it can still be Wednesday. Like, that doesn't change anything as far as it can still be Wednesday then. But then you just have like a Friday that's not a Sabbath. That's fine. But I think it just makes more sense that it was actually Thursday because he died before it was even, and he also, so you could think Thursday, Friday, Saturdays, 3 days, and then you have Friday night, Saturday, or Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, and then he rose early the first day of the week. So in Luke chapter 24 and verse 21, it says, "But we trusted that it had been he which should have redeemed Israel, and beside all this, today is the 3rd day since these things were done." Now, if you know the story, this is actually in the evening that he says this. Now, obviously, I don't believe that Jesus rose in the evening on the first day of the week, but he's basically saying today, even once they were getting to the evening, today is the 3rd day. This is where it is the road to Emmaus. Remember, he was walking with Jesus, and they were talking about Jesus, even though that was Jesus. And he says today is the 3rd day since these things were accomplished, or these things were done. And so, to me, that makes sense, because if you're thinking Thursday, today would be the 3rd day since those things had been done. And so that's why I believe Jesus died on the 9th hour. And so you have part of Thursday, and you would technically have part of Sunday in there too. And so, but that just makes sense just in the way I would think about it. And so, but that also answers, with the 14th day, that's the bigger thing with the whole contradiction, is that the 14th day started when Jesus was in the 14th day when he ate the Lord's Supper. When he ate the Last Supper with his disciples, it was the 14th day. It was at the beginning of the 14th day, but it was the Passover. That whole 14th day is called the Passover. And so there's nothing wrong with saying that he ate with his disciples on the Passover, because it was. And obviously, why do you think he did that in the morning instead of the evening? Because he was going to be on the cross, right? So he did that at the beginning of the day because he was going to the cross. And he was actually going to be that literal lamb that was going to be slain for all the people. And so, just make sure I'm not missing anything. The Sabbath days, that answers the Sabbath day question as far as why the next day was a Sabbath. So when you look at that chart, what you'll see is it explains what's going on. So the Thursday, you had the preparation of the Passover, the 14th day. I don't believe that was ever called a Sabbath day, so it wasn't, that's why they were, that's why the Jews said, hey, we don't want to go into the judgment hall, we don't want to be defiled, because we want to eat the Passover, because it hadn't been killed yet. And Jesus died when they were killing the Passover. Talk about, ridiculous not seeing the fact that you're killing the lamb, right? You're killing your Messiah, you're killing your Christ. And you did it on the exact day you were killing your lamb for the Passover. And so, remember, the 10th day would have been Sunday, so when they did the palms and all that stuff. So all this stuff matches up perfectly with the timeline of the Passover and those feasts. And then, so the Friday would have been the high Sabbath day, which was the first day, or the 15th day of the month, which was a Sabbath. Now, obviously, there was going to be another Sabbath later on, to end that feast. And then Saturday was a Sabbath, just the end of the week Sabbath. What's also interesting about this is the first day of the week was also a feast of the Lord. It was called the first fruits. Go to Leviticus chapter 23. If you ever thought that the Bible wasn't miraculous, Just look at this right here, of what always been fulfilled. Go to Leviticus. So Leviticus 23 is all about the feast of the Lord. So we've already done with the feast of the Passover. It's actually, I believe, fulfilling the end of the day Sabbath too. Notice that end of the day Sabbath's in there when Jesus died on the cross. And you could say that the end of the day Sabbath is a feast of the Lord because it's in the list of feasts of the Lord, dealing with the seventh day of the week is a holy convocation unto you. And so that was something they did every week. And these other feasts we're dealing with throughout the year. And so all this stuff's being fulfilled. So if you count the end of the day Sabbath, you have 7 different feasts. 4 of which were already fulfilled with Christ, and we'll see also with the disciples dealing with the day of Pentecost. But notice what it says here in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 in verse 10, it says, this is right after we're talking about the Passover, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." Now what you'll see here is that morrow after the Sabbath is dealing with the morrow after the Sabbath of the Passover. Now, it doesn't always line up like this, because let's say they killed the lamb, the Passover was on a Monday or something like that. That means the next Sabbath day, that morrow after Sabbath day, which would be the first day of the week, every time it would be the first day of the week, but it didn't necessarily be in the same line as far as when the Passover happened. Does that make sense? Because the Passover would be on a Sunday, it could be on a Monday, it could be on a Tuesday. But the next Sabbath, the morrow after the Sabbath, is where they would basically do this sheaf offering, where it was to represent the first fruits of the harvest. And so what was the day after the Sabbath in this case? Sunday, the day Jesus rose from the dead. What is Jesus called? The first fruits of them that slept. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. We know that Jesus is the first fruits of his creatures. It says in James chapter 1. He is the first fruits of the resurrection. Christ the first fruits. If you look at the resurrection, which I'm not going to preach on that all this morning, but there's 3 different resurrections. You have Jesus, who's the first fruits. He's the only one right now that's ever risen from the dead, that's in a bodily, spiritual body. He's the only one right now. But then they that are Christ that is coming, so that's, the second coming of Christ. We're all going to be changed in the moment and twinkling of an eye. And then come at the end, after the 1,000-year reign, there's going to be another resurrection dealing with the saved and lost. And so there's 3 resurrections, but Christ is the first fruits of the harvest. Jesus is the first. And so in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, it shows you that. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20, it says, "But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept." Now this isn't talking about the fact that people can now go to heaven spiritually, okay? People were already in heaven. Their souls were already in heaven before this. We're talking about bodily. Jesus was bodily. It wasn't just the spirit. Bodily resurrected. He showed them his hands and his feet. He said, "A spirit hath not flesh and bone." Right? So that's clear. So when it's talking about the first fruits, it's talking about Jesus fulfilling that. So you see how all that fell in lock and step like a glove. That you have, Jesus was killed on Thursday, the 14th day. The next day was a Sabbath. That would have been Friday. The next day was another Sabbath. That would be Saturday. Guess what the next day was? The first fruits. Because he rose from the dead that day. It all fits perfectly. And then you say, well, okay, well, what about, and if you say, well, I don't know, is that really the Sabbath day after? Well, we see from actually with the next feast that it lines up. Because the next feast is the Feast of Weeks, or what the Bible calls in the New Testament, Pentecost. The reason it calls it Pentecost because it's talking about 50 days later from the first fruits. And so if you're still in Leviticus, you can turn there, but go back to Leviticus 23. And we'll see what the Bible calls the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and there's other places, the Feast of Weeks, you'll see why it calls it the Feast of Weeks in other places. So in Leviticus 23 and verse 15, it says, Ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering. So notice that's what we were talking about, the first fruits. So you're going to count from that point right there. 7 Sabbaths shall be complete, even unto the morrow after the Sabbath, or after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. And ye shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. So from that point, you're going to number 7 Sabbaths. So what does that give you? 49 days until the morrow after, which would be 50 days. That's what Pentecost means. So Pente, when you look at other languages, that's just in many other languages, that's the number 5. And so you're dealing with 50 days from that point. So let's see if that lines up with when Pentecost happened. Now, it doesn't say 50 days was the day of Pentecost from his resurrection. But notice what it says in Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. Now, this is before the day of Pentecost. So all these feasts that we were covering here have all already been fulfilled. What they represent have been fulfilled. And I want to show you that because this next feast, the Feast of Weeks, was fulfilled at the day of Pentecost. And if you think about it, Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. This feast was basically when you're starting to gather in the fruits and all that stuff. What happened on that day? A lot of soul winning happened that day, and a lot of people got saved. The harvest was being reaped, so to speak. And so, and obviously, when you're dealing with planting stuff and gardening and all that stuff, you're reaping throughout the summer and all that stuff, and then you have the end of the year harvest. And so the harvest, we haven't got to that. So when you get to the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, that pictures something in the end times, but that hasn't been fulfilled yet. And so, but this has happened. And so you're in Acts chapter 1, verse 3. Notice what it says. To whom also he showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days. And speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God, and being assembled together with them, commanded them that they should not depart from Jerusalem, but wait for the promise of the Father, which saith he, ye have heard of me. For John only truly baptized with water, but ye shall be baptized with the Holy Ghost not many days hence. So he's saying, I've been with you 40 days. And he's been with them 40 days. And this chapter is where they see him, ascend up into heaven. And he's saying, wait in Jerusalem, right? And obviously what's going to happen in about 10 days later, the day of Pentecost. And so you see how this lines up perfectly? From when he rose from the dead and he saw them, they saw him 40 days. So what that shows me is that there's about 10 days from when he rose, ascended up into heaven, until the day of Pentecost. And so this all fits perfectly. So all those feasts were fulfilled perfectly. But what is the, I believe there's a significance of why Jesus, when he was in the grave, he was in the grave and his soul was in hell during Sabbath days. And, that was a fulfillment of them. So we already read that in Colossians chapter 2 on how, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. So I believe he fulfilled that when he died on the cross, nailing it to his cross, the ordinances that were against us and all this stuff. But go to Hebrews chapter 4, because I want to talk about this for a second. Because obviously, if you run into someone that says, hey, you need to keep the Sabbath, I take them to Colossians chapter 2, case closed, right? Colossians chapter 2 is going to just annihilate that argument. But if you had more time and they really want to talk about it, you can talk about the fact of what did the Sabbath even represent? What was the purpose of the Sabbath? Why was it so strict on the fact of you weren't to do any work, and if you did, you were to be put to death? Because people are looking at me like, oh, the Sabbath day, why is that so strict? Well, what did it represent? So in Hebrews chapter 4, notice how it starts off here. We're talking about the gospel. We're talking about people getting saved. It says in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 1, let us therefore fear, lest the promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Now, what does it say about Jesus? It says in Revelation 13:8, it says he's the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So the works were done from the foundation of the world. That's why when he rested the seventh day, he was saying, it's done. I've finished all my works, because he's eternal. Jesus is as if he had already died on the cross for our sins and paid it with his own blood from the foundation of the world. That's what the Bible teaches. Now, obviously, it says he was before ordained before the foundation of the world, but it says that he was manifest in these last times for you, right? So we know that in the time frame, as far as being in time with us, he came later on to fulfill that. But to God, he's speaking of those things which be not as though they were. And so we know that that's why he's saying this. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world, because he's the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And so it goes on here. So it's talking about actually different Sabbath days, because with God resting on the seventh day, that's the seventh day Sabbath. That's why they would have the seventh day Sabbath, because it represented of God working 6 days, creating the whole world and the universe, and then resting the seventh day. But also there's another rest that, talking about coming into the promised land, was like a picture of that rest. It says, in verse 4, it says, "For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works. And in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest." So if you know, chapter 3 is talking about them entering into the promised land when they came out of Egypt. But so that's the second place that it's dealing with this rest. But then it says in verse 6, "Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached enter not in because of unbelief. Again he limiteth a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God, for he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his." Now, what you see here is Jesus actually in this is talking about Joshua, because if you go from the Old Testament to New Testament, that's Joshua goes into Jesus. So you'll see actually 2 places in the Bible where Jesus is talking about Joshua, the son of Nun. But we see here that it's talking about, if Joshua would have given them rest, meaning that wasn't the true rest. That was a picture of it, just like the picture of the seventh day was that. But we're talking about the true rest, which is heaven. Now, the true rest that we get is when we cease from all our works. Now, what the Sabbath represents is the fact that when Jesus was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, and his soul was in hell for 3 days and 3 nights, everybody outside was doing no work at all. No servile work. It was a holy convocation. No work at all, but Jesus was doing it all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe, right? It's all him, that he's doing all the work. And so I believe the Sabbath represented salvation, that it was to be no work at all. Not one. No, not one, right? Well, now go to Numbers chapter 15, and this story will give you a little more understanding of why someone was put to death for not keeping the Sabbath day. And when you read it to begin with, you'll be like, good night. That seems a little harsh. But when you understand what it represents, just as much as, giving a sacrifice is supposed to represent Christ, and they would give like the sick and the maimed and all that stuff, and why God hated that, and why God wanted to spread dung in their faces because of what their sacrifices were. And you may read, well, man, that's rough. That is really rough. Why? Because it was supposed to picture his son. It was supposed to picture Christ and his being infallible, being pure, being without spot, and they were putting stuff up there that was, and it was a bad picture. That's why the high priest would die if they went into the holiest of all, if they had any sin or if they were guilty of any big iniquities and stuff like that. Because why? The high priest represents Christ. So that's why there's these big punishments on these certain things that they had to do back then. But in Numbers chapter 15 verse 32, it says, "And while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron and unto all that congregation, and they put him in ward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died as the Lord commanded Moses. Now when you first read that, you're like, man, that's strict. Man, that's rough. But what did the Sabbath represent? It represents the fact that salvation is by faith alone, by grace alone, without works. And just as much as picking up sticks, and as small as that looks, as far as, keeping the Sabbath day, you're just picking up some sticks, trying to clean your yard a little bit. That's what God thinks about when you're trying to say, well, I'm just going to do this one thing. Yeah, it's just Jesus, but I also have to get baptized. It's just Jesus, but I also have to live a good life. It's just Jesus, but I'm not going to kill somebody. That's what it looks like to God. And he says, put him to death. Now, we would look at it, and if you think about, in the New Testament, the fact, the famous verses, for by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. Not of works, lest any man should boast. And if by grace, then isn't no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. Or works is no more works. And so, grace is no more grace. And that verse right there is like back and forth. But in Galatians it says, I do not frustrate the grace of God, for if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Galatians chapter 4 says, behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever you are justified by law, ye are fallen from grace. And it says that, for we through the Spirit of God, we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. Christ shall profit you nothing. Christ has become of no effect unto you if you're justified by the law in one little matter, even if it's just picking up sticks. Even if you said picking up sticks was a part of me getting to heaven, and as small as that is, Christ shall profit you nothing. And so that's why it was such a big deal. That's why keeping the Sabbath was such a big deal, and because of what it represented. But Christ fulfilled that on the cross. Now, they were put to death physically in the Old Testament, but if you don't get saved by grace alone, you're going to be put to death spiritually. And you think about Revelation 2 and verse 11, where it says, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now that's what you need to be worried about. Not just the physical death, but the second death, where your both soul and body are cast into the lake of fire. And it says, for whatsoever is born of God overcometh the world, and this is the victory that overcometh the world, even our faith. Who is he that overcometh the world? But he that believeth that Jesus is the Son of God. So when it's talking about whosoever overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death, it's talking about those that believe on Jesus Christ. Those that have put their faith in Christ. And so those are the ones that are actually keeping the Sabbath, so to speak. See how it's all just a shadow of things to come? How it's just a representation of what was to come? So even the Sabbath day, it had a picture, it had a point. And even today, if you had one day that you wanted to rest, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think there's definitely a lot of validity to it, just as much as there's a lot of other cardinal ordinances of things to like keep clean and do other things that you don't have to do. It's like the washing of hands. They were going against Jesus for not washing his hands when he ate. And Jesus, was saying that's not a commandment. But is it smart to wash your hands before you eat? Probably, If I just got done working on my car and I had oil all over my hands, I'm probably going to wash my hands before I, take a bite into that sandwich. And so all I'm saying with that is that obviously the Sabbath day, if you wanted to have a Sabbath day, I'm all for you, whatever you want to do. But it's not something that we're keeping today. Jesus fulfilled it. Even when he was in the grave and when his soul was in hell, he was fulfilling it. That is completely fulfilled. And so that's the timeline of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. So I know this is more kind of like a Bible study than anything, but if anybody ever brings that up to you and you have all these people that are all constantly trying to go against the Bible, constantly trying to discount the Bible, and they'll say, well, when was the Passover? Was it when Jesus, was it the day before he was killed, or was it on the day that he was killed? And so they're going to try to throw this type of stuff at you and different things. Well, did the cock crow once or did he crow twice? And they try to throw all these little things at you. And here's the thing. You may not understand it, but there is an answer to it. There is an answer to it. The cock crow twice, I'll just give you that one real quick because a lot of people have that one that they think about. In Mark is where it says the cock crowed twice. What you have to understand is that that roosters crow all the time, okay? But when it says in Mark chapter 13, it talks about Jesus Christ coming, it says whether it be in the morning or at the cock crowing, or in the evening or at midnight. The cock crowing, I believe, represented the sun rising. So it'd be like it's saying at dawn, right? So in the other passages where it says before the cock shall not crow until thou shalt deny me thrice, what he's saying is that it's not going to be dawn until you deny me. Mark, he's giving you more information that the cock crew once before dawn, and then he crew at dawn. Okay, simple, right? It's simple. It's to understand. But the people that hate God, they're looking for that stuff. They're always trying to find something, and it fits like a glove. And so you may say, well, Leviticus is rough to read. Hey, there's a lot of good information in Leviticus. Leviticus 23 is a very interesting chapter. Leviticus 25 with the year of Jubilee. I'll probably get into the fall feast eventually when you're dealing with the year of Jubilee and the Day of Atonement and all that stuff, and how that lines up perfectly with end times prophecy. There's no way that a man just wrote this book. Okay, there's no way that all this stuff fits together just like that, and it's just a coincidence that it all fits together like that. But praise be to God for what he did, what Jesus did on the cross. I'm just giving you information as far as the timeline, but think about what he did. And obviously we're going to be doing the Lord's Supper tonight, so we'll be thinking about that and remembering his death tonight. But just an amazing book, how it was all fulfilled. God is perfect, God is true. And let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this morning and pray that you'd be with us throughout the rest of the day. I pray that you'd be with the soul-winning efforts, but also be with us as we travel, and especially for those that have traveled a long ways, Lord, I pray that you give them safe travels, and Lord, just pray that you'd bless the fellowship that we have together. And we love you and pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.